Julia, I am so excited to talk to you today. How are you?
I'm very good, thank you. A little cold.
Same. It comes with the winter territory, doesn't it?
Yes, yes.
Well, today we're talking about quitting. And I read in your new book that you asked, I believe it was over 150 people, the same question. And so I'm going to ask you the question that you asked 150 some odd people, which is, what is the most significant thing you've ever quit? And do you regret it?
Well, see, that's a great question because, like all of us, I think I have several things that I've quit, but more often than not, we more regret the things we don't quit that we should have than the things we did, which just makes the point that became apparent to me with talking with all those people is that quitting is something that really resonates with everybody. It has a terrible ring to it. To call somebody a quitter is just about the worst thing you can. But in my own case, I talk a bit in the book about when I quit graduate school. My first foray into graduate school was an absolute disaster. I was way too young. I was away from home. I was 19 years old. I had no business teaching courses and taking courses at a university in graduate school. But I tried it and it was terrible. I didn't want to quit, but I had to. It was probably the one of the worst moments of my life when I truly was on edge. You know, I felt that my emotional equilibrium was really in danger at that point. Looking back on it, it was a good move. Although I'll say, and I think probably some of your listeners will agree, often when you look back on anything that you quit, it's a good move. I rarely, and all those people I interviewed, I rarely had a lot of regret. Most people, as I said, wish they had quit things sooner. And even when they had regret, it was in perhaps the way that they did it, not the fact that they did it. Because too often we stay in bad situations because we want to just hang on as hard as we can to a situation instead of letting it go with the expectation of something better.
Hmm. Yeah, I found myself reminiscing about my big quits in my 38 years so far as I was reading your book. And for me, I would say the most significant one was quitting my job, my career, teaching. And I don't regret it one bit. If I could go back, I wish I had the courage to have quit sooner because I knew in my gut and my soul it wasn't for me, but I stuck with it because I was afraid. And so when we talk about quitting, you mentioned the anti-quit bias. It's quitting has a really negative connotation associated with it. And we're all about going against the grain here on this podcast. Quitting definitely goes against the grain. But why is quitting so looked down upon, in your opinion?
I think, I really think it harkens back to the middle of the 19th century when the whole self-help ethos began. Now, there's nothing wrong with trying to make yourself a better person, but what happens of the self-help idea, which again began, a man named Samuel Smiles wrote a book in 1859. He was a Scot, done a lot of different things. He wrote a book called Self-Help with illustrations of character and conduct and coined that phrase. His view was that we are all completely and totally in charge of our own lives. And of course, the self-help movement has to stand behind that, has to say, yes, it's all up to you. Everything is in your own hands. And if things don't work out, it's because you're a quitter, a whiner, a crybaby. But the problem with that is it fails to recognize that very often things happen to us that we can't plan on, we didn't cause, we can't, people get sick, a fire or a flood or a natural catastrophe destroys something you may have spent your entire life building. So what the self-help ethos fails to recognize is the things that just happen to us. It puts us in charge of our own lives. And worse than that, I think, and where quitting really becomes kind of a really treacherous way to think about the world, is that it makes us less tolerant of other people who have had difficulties in their life. We become judgmental scolds. It's like, well, look what happened to you. Well, of course, you quit. I mean, the worst people you can think of are the people who are very judgmental about other people and things that have not worked out for them. So I guess that's part of my reason for wanting to explore quitting, is not only what it does to the individual to have this idea that, nope, you must hang in there at all costs. And if you work hard, you'll win. If you quit, if you don't persevere, you'll lose. Well, would that life were that simple? It isn't. Life is complex. It's paradoxical. As I said, things happen all the time that we can't control. And it just would make us a little more tolerant, I think, to look upon quitting as a life strategy instead of as a surrender or a capitulation.
Hmm. In your book, you really drilled down the point that quitting serves a purpose. It shakes things up, it wakes us up so that we can move forward. You also say, though, that quitting is an act of love. How is quitting an act of love?
Yeah, that was something I came up with after I'd written the book and done all the interviews and talked to neuroscientists about what happens in our brains when we choose one path over another. And I started thinking, trying to just kind of be quiet for a moment amidst all the research, kind of push that aside and think about it. And I thought, it's an act of love because it's an act of generosity. It's an act of love towards yourself. It's saying, I want to believe in a better place than where I am now. When you hang on to a bad situation, hang on to something that just isn't working out, you're not really using all of your gifts and talents to their full potential. But if you can get to that place where you say, I love myself enough to take this risk and take this leap. And of course, the greatest risks are really not risks at all. I mean, that's where we need to be. And the greatest risk is not to take one. So I guess that's how I meant it, is that it's an act of generosity towards yourself and toward the world. You're saying, I deserve better, and I know the world wants to give me better if I just get out of the way and give it the chance.
Yeah, it's an act of self-love. It's a way of showing, not just saying or telling yourself that you trust yourself, but really putting that trust in your ability to pivot to the test in real time. And I think a lot of the times, and you've mentioned that we do stay in situations, a job, a relationship, a geographical location, whatever it is, a grad school program for longer than we should. And in your book, I loved the comparison between honeybees and Simone Biles, of course, the US multiple gold medal wearing gymnast. You say that honeybees and Simone Biles both know when to strategically quit. I'm hoping that you'll be willing to talk us through those two examples and also tell my listeners, how do we know, what happens inside us? How do we know when it's time to strategically quit something?
Right. Yes. Actually, the Simone Biles example came to me I talked to a lot of scientists too, because I thought, how do the other animals on this planet, how do they deal with quitting? I mean, animals quit all the time. They have to. It's a survival strategy. If you're a finch on Galapagos Island and your only food is a seed that's inside of a very hard plant called a caltrop, has a very thorny hide on the outside. If that finch spends too long trying to get a seed out of a particular plant that has a hard hide, he will perish. I mean, they live on a very narrow margin of existence. So at some point, the finch has to decide, you know what? I'm moving on. This one is not working out. So we know that animals quit all the time. If a lion is chasing prey, becomes too innervated, that lion himself will become prey. Lions have to, or all animals have to live on this very constant balance of energy expenditure as they're trying to get food in order to survive. The Simone Biles example came to me. I interviewed a wonderful entomologist, Justin Schmidt, probably the premier entomologist in the country. He deals with stinging insects. He's written a book called The Sting of the Wild, which is quite wonderful. And he pointed out that honeybees sting when they're going to protect their nest. We all know that, they protect the hive. Only the females sting, and when they sting, they die. They're eviscerated. So that honeybee has to make sure that if they're going to sting, it has to be for a good purpose. You think that, well, they always sting. Anybody comes to the nest, they're going to sting a potential predator. Turns out not. This is what Dr. Schmidt's research showed. The honeybee makes a calculation. When a predator approaches, the honeybee decides two things very quickly. Decides, is the predator really a threat? And number two, is the hive fertile enough to warrant the sacrifice of a life? And in a way, that's why I make the analogy to Simone Biles. To me, here she is, one of the greatest athletes in the world. And she knows she's just not right. She's not feeling right. And her sport is one, of course, with the risk of catastrophic injury or death is always there. I mean, enormously difficult sport, as we all know. So this is what she has to do. She has to make this calculation. Is this worth the cost of my life? Just like a honeybee does when protecting the nest. And to me, that's why part of the genius of Simone Biles is to be able to make that calculation and indeed to take a lot of the guff that she got from people. I mean, most of us, I think in our circles, people were like, hey, you go girl, this is great. You know, we recognize that this was an act of heroism, really. But there were people that said, no, 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 you let down the country, you let down your team. What's the matter with you? You quitter. Heard the word quitter a lot. And actually, it's the opposite. Like a honeybee, like animals in the wild, Simone Biles made this calculation so that she could continue her sport and continue her life, and not that it was not risk the cost. It was not worth the risk of her injury or death in order to do this at that moment. So she quit, and it was an act of heroism.
I don't know hardly anything about football. However, I live in New England, and everybody always talks about Tom Brady, everything. And there's lots of football lovers around wondering why he hasn't strategically quit, why he hasn't retired, perhaps. And so your example of one of the greatest athletes in the world, Simone Biles, weighing the danger versus what's at stake, really hits home for me as I, on a Tuesday evening speaking with you, think about Tom Brady, who's really staying in the game for as long as possible.
And making up his mind right now. First, let me just say I'm shocked you're not a football fan, because I live and breathe football. I absolutely adore it. So here I thought you and I, things were going so well. Now you tell me that. But no, that's a great example. There's the Simone Biles example, who says, hey, here's what I'm going to do. Then there's Tom Brady. I have to tell you, as much of a football fan as I am, and as much as I love the idea that someone can play at that high of a level at his age, and with some physical deterioration, which of course there is, I hold my breath every time I watch the man play, because every play could be the last one. Catastrophic injury is lurking right around the corner. So it's difficult for me to watch him play now. I have to admit, because of that. I know he's just looks a little frail back there. Now, that if he heard me say that, he'd come and punch me in the nose. But I do think that your point is well taken. We see the Simone Biles example, then the Tom Brady example. Who's right? And the answer is, it depends on whether you're Simone or you're Tom. It is absolutely an individual decision. And that's why I hope we can get beyond the word quitter as a pejorative. And then we wouldn't worry so much about what name people call us. I mean, as kids, we all hate to be called a quitter. And if we could remove the sting from that word, I think we might go a little bit longer down the road toward letting people be who they are, make their own decisions, and not sit in judgment of other people and assume that they quit because they're lazy or cowardly.
Well, Tom Brady, if you're listening, if you want to send me a little hate email, I'm here for it. I don't like getting hate emails, but Tom Brady, you can send it to me. That would be okay. Julia, we're moving into the part of the conversation where I want to talk about the how. It's not easy to quit our jobs or leave a relationship or drop out of grad school or whatever the thing is, big or small, that we're thinking about quitting. How exactly do you suggest, once we decide we're going to do it, how do we quit high stakes situations?
I have a chapter in the book, which I call quasi-quitting, which means that quitting doesn't have to be an either or. I say it's not like a light switch. It's more like a rheostat dial. I use some historical examples, like Henry James. He decided he wanted to be a playwright instead of writing novels. Well, it was a disaster. He was booed off the stage. People threw things. Sometimes theater goers are not kind. You get an instant response. Unlike a book author, you might never meet anyone who hates your book. Poor Henry James had to endure people really yelling at him and calling him nasty names. But he didn't stop writing. He just stopped writing plays. He went back to novels. It's an example of a quasi-quit. Tiger Woods, he's another example of someone. He didn't stop playing golf, but because he was somewhat limited after having that horrific car accident, he changed his expectation that he always had to finish number one. Someone asked him in the match he was in after his terrible car accident, it said, "Is just finishing now an achievement for you?" And he said, "Yes." And that's an amazing thing for a man who had never accepted, a magnificent athlete who had never accepted anything less than a first place finish as being something he even cared about at all. But he did, because his circumstances had changed. So the thing I would say to people is, you make that decision, but it doesn't have to be all or nothing. You can change your circumstances, you can pause, and you can pivot. So stop, think about where you are, where you want to be, make a plan, make a strategy. But again, not an all or nothing either or thing. I come from a very all or nothing family. I mean, we're famous for like great renunciations, like I shall never return to another Thanksgiving, that sort of thing. And then we proceed to try to storm out the door, and it never works. Usually back within about 10 minutes, and people apologize, and on it goes, like every family. So that's the kind of example of quitting we don't want to do, which is something in a great fury or in a great gust of emotion. To me, the really strategic quitting, and what I call precision quitting, is when you are smart about it and canny about it, and you think about what comes next. I interview a physician that I talk about in the book, and he deals specifically with physicians at Northwestern University who want to quit medicine. During the pandemic, as we know, a lot of healthcare workers so overburdened, so overstressed. That's it. They were done. They wanted to, take off their stethoscopes and throw them in the trash. And his job specifically was to meet with those physicians. And he told me that what he would often do is say, quit to what? What's going to lie beyond this quitting moment? You're going to feel good when you quit. You're going to march out this door and say, that's it. I won't take this anymore. But what about what after? And he said, when you can answer the question, quit to what lies next, then maybe you're ready. Until then, he would say to them, just pause and maybe pivot, maybe change your circumstances, your work circumstances, see if you can change your hours, see if something can change to make it a little more palatable. So to get away from the all or nothing thinking and the kind of emotion driven act, which sometimes works out, sometimes doesn't. It's always very dramatic, always very, when you look back upon it, it's a fun story to tell, but it's not fun to live through.
Right. Yeah. I think what I hear you saying there is when you can quit in a dumpster fire situation, right? Like you can burn up your workplace or whatever it is as you quit, or you can leave emotion out of it. And that's where the strategic part of strategically quitting comes into play. How does strategic quitting differ from quiet quitting, though? I see, oh my gosh, the newspapers love to write about quiet quitting these days. And listeners, if you don't know what quiet quitting is, it's this new pandemic phenomenon for millennials and Generation Yers, in which, you do the minimum necessary at your job. You put in no extra time, no extra effort, definitely no extra enthusiasm than you absolutely have to do to collect your paycheck. So what do you say to quiet quitters, and where does that fall into this conversation?
I despise the notion of quiet quitting. Absolutely despise it. It's completely the opposite of what I was talking about, and completely the opposite of quasi-quitting. To me, quiet quitting is it's basically thievery. You're basically not working and you still take a paycheck. And you're so right. It did become a thing, although it did seem to quiet down a bit, if you will. But to me, it's not even a legitimate response to a bad situation. Either have the courage to change the situation, ask to change it. If it's that bad, try to change it first. But quiet quitting to me, as I said, is just kind of like not working at all and just kind of being a bum and putting your feet up on your desk and hoping nobody notices. And it just doesn't seem very admirable to me. Quitting does take a lot of courage. Giving up on something and moving to something else takes courage. And also, as we were mentioning earlier, an optimism. There's a kind of a golden radiant optimism that's at the heart of great changes we make in our life, that we make throughout our lives, depending on our age or what situation we're in. It's a great optimism. I'm not a naturally optimistic person at all, but in writing this book and in talking to so many, many people, dozens of people, about times when they made great changes in their life, I found it quite inspiring. We really can do it. Just ordinary people. I mean, I'm not Simone Biles. I'm not Tom Brady, Lord knows, but I'm able to make some strategic pivots in my life and try to make things a little bit better. And I'm sure there are many more that lie ahead. I mean, I hope we all have a lifetime of quitting.
Well, I'm thinking about a listener who's listening to our conversation right now, and they're saying to themselves, yeah, easy for them to say, I can't just quit my job, or I can't just divorce my partner because, hello, finances. And I think I'm not even going to ask you that question because I know what your answer would be. Your answer would be to quasi-quit, to come up with a plan and don't, go out in a burst of flames. I think that's what you would say, and correct me if I'm wrong. But my real question here is, what do you say to the other listeners who are listening and they're nodding their heads and they're on board and we're speaking to their souls? They're thinking about quitting something, but they're paralyzed by the worry that they're going to regret that quitting down the road.
That's a great question, because in a way I feel a little silly giving anybody life advice. I think we all do, those of us that write, nonfiction, and we're trying to say, see the world my way. I certainly have been in very difficult situations that I have stayed in too long, as have we all. And that's one of the great things that I took away from all the conversations that I had. Everybody is afraid. Everybody at all times, we're all afraid. And once I kind of realized that, even people that seem to have it all together deep inside, when they would kind of like care to reveal these moments and how difficult it was. I talked to a woman who'd been a nurse, had trained to be a nurse, spent all this money, her family spent on. First day on the job, she realizes this is absolutely not right for me. I cannot do this for the next, 40, 50 years, whatever working life is now. And she said, I can't do it, but how do I tell people? She said, I was ashamed to tell people. I was afraid. She somehow found the courage to do it. I mean, there are several steps she took along the way. I think it really becomes a matter of life and death, what kind of life you're going to have, of not wanting to kind of just go through the motions. And I certainly understand the financial constraints that people have. But again, I can only give you the evidence of the people that I spoke with. And that is, the vast preponderance of people did not regret quitting something. They regretted not quitting it sooner, not taking that step when they should have. Sometimes we wait until things are really bad before we take another step. And I should emphasize too, that it's not just quitting things like jobs, and it's also ways of thinking. I know for me, I've always been kind of a controlling person. Like with my family, I'm a little bit, I guess bossy is a word I hear a lot. Of course, my answer is always, well, if there's a power vacuum, I'm going to fill it. But that's something I've had to quit or try to quit. I mean, it's a habit that's very hard to break. I always know better. Of course, don't we all? But try to let people live their lives the way that they see fit, even though I know they're heading toward a complete mistake. But just to step back, I mean, parents face this all the time, of course, is to let people make their own mistakes. And that's what I guess I would say. If, we know in science, what we do is we gather a lot of data, and we look at that data, and we extrapolate from the data what's the best course ahead. And I can tell you that everybody I spoke with had a difficult time, felt that fear, worked through the fear, and then it was okay. That we make these changes all the time, and it's not making the change that ends up being the real blow, not so much making it. And it will be difficult for a while, and you will make the wrong decisions. I mentioned earlier that life is unfair, life is uncertain. You will make the wrong decisions. There are things that I've quit that I probably shouldn't have. And all we can do is just try to learn from those mistakes and go forward. But those mistakes of commission, as opposed to the ones of omission, seems to me to have a kind of an energy behind them, and a light and a radiance, and they kind of propel us forward, because we all deserve a better life, and collectively a better world.
You had a sentence in your book that I copied down because it really just spoke to me. And your words were, quote, "Our lives can be transformed in positive ways when we quit, because we can swap one destiny for another." So to anybody listening who's thinking, oh, I'm worried I'll regret it, remember, you can transform your life for the better. You can swap one destiny for another. I just find that to be such a powerful way of framing this conversation. Julia, before we say goodbye, I want to give a nod to the parents listening. I have a lot of parents who listen to this show, and as a parent myself, I struggle with wanting my daughters to stick with something, whatever the thing is, and not quit prematurely. You want them to get really good at something. You want them to get over the hump before they decide it's not for them, or at least I do. That's what I struggle with a lot of times. What do you say to the parents listening who want to best support their children when their children want to quit something? I'm thinking maybe a sport or an instrument or an extracurricular. What do you say to them?
I have an entire chapter on that for that very reason, because it's such a huge issue. I tell it from both sides. The parents who are trying to decide, okay, so my kid wants to quit the basketball team. Is that okay? When do you push? I interviewed several teachers too. When do you push students and tell them you can work harder, or when do you lay off and say they kind of got it here, and this is not really working out for them. Maybe they need to be in another level of this. And I also talked to some kids, some who wanted to quit things and who went to their parents and who were afraid of, had a tremendous guilt when they go to parents and say, I want to quit this, but I was really afraid that my mom was going to be mad at me. I wanted to quit gymnastics. Would that be okay? So in answer to your question, it's a very nuanced thing. I interviewed several parents who talked about that they use their own quitting as kind of as a model to use it to start a conversation with their children and to say, are you quitting because, to use your example, Stephanie, it's hard. It's just got a little too hard and you kind of wanted to hang out with your friends instead of going to practice. Okay, that's not an okay quitting. But do you want to quit because there's some other issue involved? A friend of mine had a son was playing football and he really didn't like it. He didn't like the physicality of it. He was physically robust. He didn't like hurting other kids. And he said to his mom, I just don't like hurting people anymore. And she said, got it. Okay, that's it. It's the reason you're quitting. And it's kind of digging down deep into the reasons and pulling back the layers and saying, again, am I just not feeling it today? I'd rather play a video game, or is there something deeper here? And parents can find that out through conversation, which is always a good thing, of course. So that's why I devoted a lot of space in the book to that very question. What do you do when people come to you asking for advice? A child, maybe a best friend, comes and says, I don't know. I just things just aren't working out. Should I leave this marriage, this job, this church? What should I do next? It's a very complex thing. Quitting is not this simple either or. And that's what I hope that people will take away from the book. And we're just, as you know, in the book, I also discuss the neuroscience of quitting. What actually happens in the brain when you choose one path or another? We know the specific neurons and where they are in the brain when you change your behavior. It's a brain issue. And the more times you quit, the more activity you create in your brain. And a healthy brain is a brain that's constantly working. So I call quitting aerobics for your brain.
I love that. Yeah, we do aerobics for our bodies. Why not for our brain as well? I just want to go back to your points to the parents that you just made and say that for me, I think a big step also for parents when you have a child who's thinking about quitting something is to take yourself and your own childhood and your own hopes and dreams or your own lost hopes and dreams out of the equation. I know for me, I was a really, for lack of a better word, lazy kid, like teenager. I didn't do extracurriculars. I much preferred to like go home and sit on the couch. And I look back at my own childhood and say to myself, well, why didn't I like stick with anything? Why, like, what could I be now if I had tried harder? But I can't change my own adolescence. There's no point in going backwards. And so I feel as though when my oldest daughter says she wants to quit a sport, my first instinct is always to tell her to stick with it because of my feelings as though I didn't apply myself. And so just taking yourself out of it and remembering it's not about me, the parent, it's about Ani, my daughter. And so that's just something like a reminder. We all know that, but it's important to remind ourselves because in practice that can be really hard. Parenting, just like quitting, is very hard. So Julia, I want to wrap up. I want to ask you about your book, but before we do that, I have a very important question that has nothing to do with quitting. I have you here, so I'm just going to ask you, what is it like to win the Pulitzer Prize?
Oh, it truly is a career-changing honor. It's something you never expect. You work in journalism and you hear this legend of these big prizes, but it was wonderful. It said it really was a great experience. It was a long series I'd worked on with no expectation of any sort of prize like this. I don't know. I mean, maybe some people do start out with something and think this is it. But not at all. I mean, I was working on a story. It was multiple interviews over many months, and I really had no idea that it was even in the offing, but it was a great honor. And it does indeed change your life.
And you are, the lessons in your book personified, right? From grad school dropout the first time to Pulitzer Prize winning journalist. I mean, amazing.
There you go. I was going to tell you one more quick story of a student. When you mentioned you're talking about your daughter, I think it's so true. One of the teachers I interviewed told a great story about a student she had in class, and he wanted to quit. He hated school, hated it. And she said his parents were upset. They wanted him to be a student. They were teachers. They believed in education. So she said, I told them, relax. I know Todd. I've watched him. I know his learning style. He's going to be fine. And she said, but they were just heartbroken. He dropped out of school. And she said, now he designs computer websites and video games. She said, it's worked out magnificently for him. I knew it would, but they couldn't see it because it was not their way of viewing the world. And she said, being a great student was important to them, but it wasn't important to Todd. And I love that story because that was a teacher that did just as you're saying, took herself and the parents' expectations out of it and said, he's going to be okay. I just love that story.
Hmm. So tell us about your new book, Quitting a Life Strategy. When does it come out? Where can we find it? What else is in it that we didn't touch on today? Tell me all the things.
It comes out April 18th, but of course, you can pre-order on the Amazon, Barnes and Noble, any of those places. I hope that what people do when they read it is to realize it's not so much, I don't think of it as traditional self-help book. In fact, I critique self-help books. Some of them I like, okay, some of them I don't like. My opinion doesn't matter. But I just think that what we need to remember is everybody has to do it in their own way. And to suggest that we're in control of our own lives is simply wrong. And once we let go of that, let go of trying to control other people, let go of thinking we should always stay exactly where we are and never quit. Once you get into one rut, let go of all of that. Life can be so much lighter and again, more joyful. A friend of mine has a saying that says, be careful of the rut you choose. You're going to be in it a long time. But as I said, I hope people will read it. I'd love to hear from people. On the back of the book is the website. But I just think to me, it dovetails so nicely with what you try to do here on your show, which is you suggest to people there are better ways of being. Don't have to, but maybe just think about it. Here's another way of looking at something, and you can let go of the things that are burdening you. Just kind of let them go, like letting go of the string of a balloon. Watch it float away and craft a new life. And we have the chance to do that every single day.
Yes. And I just want to say, I did mention to you offline before we started recording, but Julia, I absolutely loved your book. There's nothing currently in my life that I'm thinking about quitting, but still so many little nuggets of wisdom that I've tucked away in my brain for the future, little seeds that will sprout as I continue on this confounding journey that is life. So thank you so much for coming on the show. Thank you for writing this book. I so enjoyed talking to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much.